The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with eyes hungry for justice or revenge. The silence was almost suffocating, heavy, as if everyone were waiting for a horror show about to begin. Judge Ramiro straightened his robe, trying to command respect, but the air was already tainted with rumors and resentment. In the back of the room, the whispers resembled slithering snakes, each word a poison ready to corrode the truth. It was then that Donna Vilma stood up, her body trembling with fury, contrasted with the cruel firmness in her voice. "He killed my daughter," she screamed, pointing her finger at Raul, the man who until a few months ago had been known as an influential billionaire, but now found himself cowering in the dock. The impact was immediate. A murmur gripped the audience, a collective shock that rippled through the room. Raul raised his pale face and silently denied the accusation, but the audience's verdict seemed to have already been pronounced even before the first trial. The atmosphere turned into an invisible ring, where a single mistake could decide a man's fate. Vilma spoke not only with pain, but with the strength of someone bearing the weight of loss and a thirst for punishment. Her words cut like blades. Raul poisoned Carolina with his own hands. The audience writhed in indignation, and some were already murmuring about immediate arrest. The judge called for silence, but respect had already dissolved. Raul tried to open his mouth, but his voice was drowned out by shouts and hateful looks. Every face in the audience seemed to demand an early sentence. That courtroom, which should have been a temple of justice, was increasingly becoming an arena for spectacles, where the truth was an irrelevant detail in the face of the bloodlust. Raul looked around, searching for someone who believed in his innocence, but found only accusing eyes. The weight of loneliness began to settle on his shoulders, crushing him. Vilma's accusation was not just against him, but against everything he represented: power, wealth, and, for many, impunity. The initial shock was still reverberating. People in the audience rose to their feet, some in tears, others in cries of indignation. "Murderer!" a man shouted, pointing at Raul as if he were the court's official executioner. With each accusation, the billionaire seemed to shrink further, trapped in a web of contempt that gave him no chance to defend himself. Judge Ramiro banged his gavel, demanding order, but the scales were already tipped. Public hatred had become stronger than any evidence. Vilma, capitalizing on the tide of indignation, held up a photo of Carolina, the young woman everyone now saw as a martyr. The image of the smiling girl, frozen in time, pierced the heart of the room. Raul closed his eyes, murmuring something inaudible, perhaps a plea or a memory, but no one cared about his words. The show was set, and everyone seemed ready to see him fall, regardless of the truth. Raul was breathing heavily, his heart hammering as if trying to escape his chest. He never imagined his life would fall apart so quickly. In just a few months, he had gone from a respected man to a pariah everyone wanted to see handcuffed. Vilma, overcome with grief, looked like a seasoned actress on stage, each tear carefully displayed to evoke compassion and fury in those present. "My daughter trusted Raul, and he betrayed her," she cried, her voice cracking between tears and hatred. The audience responded with murmurs of agreement, as if it were a chorus of curses. The judge, though still trying to maintain an appearance of impartiality, did not hide the gravity in his gaze, as if already convinced by the force of the emotional accusation. Raul clung to the wooden bench, as if it were the only support he had left. He knew he was alone in a battle against ghosts created by collective resentment. At that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a space for justice, but a stage for anticipated condemnation. The atmosphere pulsed with hatred and expectation. Vilma's every word was a stone thrown at Raul, and every look from the audience was a silent sentence. The billionaire, once untouchable, now seemed like a fragile shadow, about to be crushed by the tide of popular revenge. Judge Ramiro, pressured by the hostile atmosphere, took a deep breath before declaring that the trial would proceed with the analysis of the evidence. But in Raul's heart, a certainty was forming. This case was not just about Carolina's death, but about everyone's desire to see a powerful man fall from grace. The opening of the conflict was sealed, and the truth, buried under layers of hatred, seemed ever more distant from being revealed. The game had begun, and Raul was the central target. The courtroom fell into absolute silence when the judge authorized the screening of a recording found on Carolina's cell phone. The screen was positioned in front of the audience, and the lights dimmed to focus on the evidence that promised to be decisive. The video begins with Carolina, visibly nervous, arguing with Raul in her office. Her voice trembled, filled with resentment. "You'll never control me, Raul. I'd rather die than be manipulated by you." The image captured Raul trying to defend himself, but the abrupt cut in the footage left cruel doubts. With each second shown, the murmurs in the courtroom grew, like waves threatening to drown out any defense arguments. Vilma, with a dark smile, raised her voice. "My daughter already sensed your death." The recording ended at the height of tension, without revealing the outcome, but enough to paint Raul as a villain. The audience was divided between indignation and doubt, but the majority already saw him as guilty. The expressions on the audience's faces changed in seconds. Some stood in disbelief, others covered their mouths in shock. For many, this video was the final proof that Raul not only had motive, but also the cold-bloodedness to commit the crime. The whispers intensified. "It's clear as day. He threatened her." Judge Ramiro remained rigid, but his eyes reflected the gravity of the evidence. Vilma seized on the video's impact to reinforce her accusation. She knew. "My daughter knew something terrible was going to happen." Her tone was that of a mother seeking justice, but behind her tears, she hid a cruel satisfaction at seeing Raul sinking. The accused, stunned, shook his head in denial. "It's not like that. It's not like that," he murmured. But his voice was lost amid the collective clamor. The video, incomplete and mysterious, seemed more like a sentence than legitimate evidence. The weight of that recording crushed any chance of immediate defense. The image of a living Carolina facing Raul seemed to scream from the screen like a ghost demanding revenge. The audience reacted like a parallel jury, without legal right, but with devastating emotional power. Raul tried to explain, but no one listened. Every attempt to raise his voice was drowned out by cries of "murderer" and "monster." The camera, however, didn't show the entirety of the facts, only fragments convenient for the prosecution. The audience didn't care about details. For them, the narrative was already sealed. Vilma wiped away tears, but behind them was a glow of triumph, as if each tear was calculated to break hearts and condemn Raul even before the official sentence. The tension in the room was unbearable, as if everyone was waiting for the moment when the judge would declare guilty. As the screen faded, the feeling lingered in the air that something terrible had been confirmed. The atmosphere had become suffocating, as if every breath were a burden. Raul closed his eyes, trying to recall the day of that argument. He knew the video had been manipulated, strategically cut to transform him into a monster. But how could he prove it to a crowd already blinded by hatred? Vilma stepped forward once more. She didn't just suspect, she was certain you would be her downfall. The eyes fell on Raul like knives ready to pierce his skin. The judge, still undecided, urged calm, but the damage was already done. The video not only shook the court's foundations, but also cemented Raul's image as a predator in the collective imagination. Hope seemed to evaporate as his reputation was destroyed. The moment was one of utter despair for Raul. There was no lawyer at his side, no one to challenge the authenticity of the evidence. Just him, alone, before a crowd hungry for conviction. His mind raced. Who could have manipulated this? Who was behind this farce? But before he could defend himself, Vilma launched her final blow. "If any doubt remains, let my daughter's face be the final witness against this man." The phrase echoed heavily, like a hammer striking against Raul's hope. The video had transformed the hearing into a parallel court of emotions, and each viewer now seemed convinced they had witnessed the absolute truth. Raul, trembling, knew his fate was increasingly sealed, but he still hadn't imagined that the breakthrough would come from an unlikely source, capable of tearing apart the veil of lies. Judge Ramiro adjusted his glasses and, in a grave tone, announced that the court would now move on to analyzing the material evidence. The silence fell like a weight, and everyone held their breath. "First," he said, "a vial of cyanide was found in the defendant's home." The immediate murmur from the audience felt like a pent-up thunderclap, a collective fury about to explode. Then they showed the images of the vial carefully packed in plastic bags, the detail that froze the air, Raul's fingerprints imprinted on the surface of the container. The revelation was like a punch to the gut in the room. Raul shook his head desperately, repeating, "No, that's not true. I never touched that." But his words sounded weak, lost in the whirlwind of accusations. The judge remained impassive, as if fate had already been sealed. For the audience, that detail was the final nail in the coffin of innocence. The tension only increased. The prosecutor held up a crystal goblet, now kept in evidence, scientifically proven to be contaminated with traces of cyanide. The deadly detail, It was the same glass from which Carolina had drunk her last glass of wine. The audience gasped in shock, some covering their lips as if they too had tasted the poison. Raul stood up, trying to defend himself. "That glass wasn't mine. I never prepared anything for Carolina." But his words were met with looks of contempt and cynical laughter. The judge, indifferent, calmly took notes, while the audience already shouted the word guilty in an invisible chorus. Vilma, overcome with emotion, put her hand to her chest and murmured loudly enough for all to hear, "My daughter did not die in vain. Your time has come, Raul." Each piece of evidence presented seemed like a cruel blow, pushing him deeper and deeper into the abyss. Raul felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Evidence piled up like stones on his body. First the vial, then the glass, and now the forensic reports confirming cyanide poisoning. The prosecutor described in detail the suffering Carolina must have felt in her final moments, and the shocked courtroom sympathized with the victim's pain. Raul cried out in despair, "I loved Carolina. I would never do this to her." His voice echoed but fell into the void, drowned out by the condemning gazes. Judge Ramiro, cold, declared, "The evidence points to an indisputable scenario." The word indisputable hammered in Raul's ears, as if it were the epitaph of his freedom. There was no lawyer, no witnesses on his behalf, only a crowd that saw in this spectacle the chance to witness the downfall of a powerful man. The audience reacted as if the trial were an entertainment program. Each revelation drew gasps, tears, and even muffled applause. Raul alone tried to raise his voice, but no one seemed willing to listen. The judge, his face stony, continued as if following a pre-written script. The fingerprints found on the bottle belong to the accused. The liquid found in the residue from the glass is the same cyanide seized at his residence, and there is no evidence of invasion or external manipulation. Each sentence was like a final blow, suffocating any hope. Vilma, triumphant, wept theatrically, letting tears fall that seemed scripted for the scene. The inflamed audience no longer saw nuances, only the clear image of a guilty person about to receive their sentence. The trial was no longer about justice, but about satisfying the collective desire for conviction. For Raul, the courtroom was becoming a nightmare with no escape. He stood up, hands trembling, and shouted, "I'm innocent, they're plotting against me." But his voice echoed hollowly, like a last breath in an abyss. The judge didn't even lift his head, simply recording the statement as if jotting down an irrelevant detail. The audience laughed, some even mocked. "Innocent? Then how did your fingerprints get on the poison?" Raul closed his eyes, feeling the weight of injustice crush him. His mind whirled in despair, searching for any explanation, any ray of hope. But at that moment, faced with the incontrovertible evidence, even he began to doubt whether he would ever be able to prove his innocence. The entire courtroom seemed eager for just one word: guilty. And the clock of truth seemed to be already ticking the countdown to his doom. Raul was a wreck. His breath was short and ragged, as if the weight of the accusations had crushed his lungs. He struggled to his feet, his hands trembling, and pleaded, "Please, someone needs to listen to me. I didn't do this." His voice echoed through the courtroom, but there was no compassion in any of his eyes. Judge Ramiro, stone cold, simply watched him from above without moving a muscle, as if he had already decided the defendant's fate. Raul stretched out his arms, begging for defense. "I need a lawyer, I need someone to speak for me." But the room responded with a piercing silence, followed by cruel whispers. To the audience, this was not a plea for justice, but the last cry of a cornered man. His loneliness was almost palpable, contrasting with the gathering of voices calling for his head. As he begged, Raul realized his knees were trembling, threatening to give way. It was the first time in years he had felt so small, so vulnerable before a crowd that judged him mercilessly. The judge, in a cold tone, interrupted his pleas. "Mr. Raul, your statements have already been recorded. The trial will proceed." Those words sounded like a hammer of early condemnation. Raul tried to insist, "This is unfair. You're not seeing the truth." But the judge's blank stare betrayed it. The sentence was already written in silence. Vilma, on the other side, watched the scene with a mixture of triumph and contempt, as if each plea were the music to her revenge. Raul crumbled, and no one reached out. His collapse was not just physical, but the slow destruction of his soul before a court that fed on his ruin. Tears began to well up, a rare thing for a man who had always prided himself on his self-control. He, who had once dominated business rooms with his firm voice, now begged for a chance to be heard. "I swear on the memory of my parents, I did not kill Carolina," he said, his voice breaking. But instead of pity, the audience responded with bitter laughter and shouts of "Murderer! Coward!" Each word was a stone thrown at his dignity. The judge didn't react, simply continuing to leaf through documents as if distant, oblivious to the human drama before him. Raul looked around desperately, but found not a single sympathetic glance. He was completely alone, a castaway amidst a sea of hostility. The collapse was not just the downfall of one man, but the cruel spectacle the crowd had been waiting to witness. The judge's silence and the audience's indifference formed an insurmountable wall. Raul fell to his knees, as if the weight of injustice had finally crushed his resistance. "Please, at least let me prove I'm not guilty," he murmured, his voice almost fading. But the fixed, merciless gazes were stronger than any argument. Vilma, with theatrical tears, held up Carolina's photograph and said, "My daughter cries for justice, and I will not rest until I see you pay." The audience applauded, transforming the pain into a spectacle, and Raul realized he was in a circus, not a courtroom. The judge, with a cold expression, simply declared, "The case will continue based on the evidence." Each word was a stab at his hope. Raul's loneliness became absolute, his voice swallowed by the chorus of vengeance echoing off the walls of the room. The feeling of defeat settled over Raul like poison coursing through his veins. He lowered his head, his shoulders hunched, unable to bear the weight of the accusation. The silence that followed was crueler than the screams, an emptiness that announced no one believed him. It was as if the court had decided to make an example of him, regardless of his innocence. Raul cringed, muttering to himself, I didn't do it." But even his own words sounded distant, as if he no longer believed anyone could hear them. The judge closed the file and announced that they would soon advance to the final phase. Raul's fate seemed sealed, his conviction hanging like a guillotine over his head. The collapse was complete. He was a broken man, on the brink of total ruin. The courtroom seemed ready to seal Raul's fate when suddenly the doors opened with an unexpected bang. A metallic sound echoed, cutting through the heavy silence. Everyone turned, curious and indignant, only to see a small figure slowly approaching, guided by the tip of a white cane. Emily, the blind girl, invaded the audience with firm yet shaky steps. A murmur ran through the room, like a wave of disbelief. "What is that child doing here?" they whispered. Her presence seemed out of place, almost absurd, given the heavy setting of a trial, but there was something in the determination of her steps that froze even the most critical. Raul raised his head for the first time in hours. His gaze met the fragile silhouette, and within him rekindled a flame everyone thought extinguished: hope. The room was shocked. Some laughed, others shook their heads in disapproval. A little girl, in a trial like this. Judge Ramiro frowned, annoyed by the interruption, but unable to ignore the impact his entrance had caused. Emily looked up, even though she couldn't see the doubtful looks. Her voice echoed with surprising firmness. "Your Honor, don't convict the wrong man, I know the truth." The shock was immediate. Vilma almost dropped the photograph of Carolina she was holding, her expression alternating between disbelief and fury. Raul in turn murmured her name, as if it were an unexpected miracle. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or remain silent, but the tension was rising like a thunderclap about to explode. A blind child dared to face the machinery already grinding the accused. Emily advanced with difficulty, but with each step she conquered the space that had previously seemed forbidden. Her physical fragility contrasted with the strength of the words echoing from her lips. "I was there. I heard things no one else heard," she said, her voice thick with conviction. The audience erupted in murmurs, unable to believe it. "What? This child is a witness." The judge, though displeased, could not ignore it. Raul, in disbelief, let out a silent tear. Until then, it had seemed impossible that anyone would come to her defense. Vilma, in suppressed despair, reacted sarcastically. "Are we going to listen to a blind girl now? Is that what this criminal's defense is based on?" But Emily's words had already reached the audience, who, between mockery and curiosity, could not take their eyes off that unlikely figure. Disbelief turned to tension. Many wondered if a child could truly change the course of a trial already decided in the hearts of the crowd. Emily, fists clenched, raised her voice once more. "I know who was with Carolina the night she died, and it wasn't Raul." The entire courtroom held its breath. Vilma, once haughty, paled. The cold confidence she'd exuded minutes before crumbled in the face of the girl's unexpected courage. Raul, overcome with emotion, looked at Emily as if seeing a light at the end of a tunnel. The judge hesitated, gavel in hand, but didn't dare interrupt. Something greater than protocol was taking shape. The truth had finally found a voice, even if it came from childish, fragile, and blind lips. The courtroom was divided. On one side, laughter echoed in disbelief, mocking the girl's boldness. On the other, expressions of surprise and even respect appeared, acknowledging her unusual courage. Raul stood slowly, his eyes fixed on her, and for the first time, his posture wasn't one of defeat, but of gratitude. "Emily," he whispered, as if that name were the key that could unlock the door to his salvation. Vilma, seized by panic, tried to regain control. "This is absurd. This child is being manipulated," but her voice trembled, betraying a fear that grew with each word the girl spoke. Emily, serene, simply replied, "I don't need eyes to see the truth." The silence that followed was crushing, a moment in which even the most skeptical sensed that something was about to change. Emily remained standing in the center of the courtroom, dwarfed by the vastness of that stifling room, but her voice carried a weight that silenced even the most skeptical. "Miss Vilma," she said firmly, "you haven't told everything you know about that night, have you?" The audience reacted in unison, a mixture of surprise and shock. Vilma, flushed with anger, tried to maintain her composure. "How dare you accuse me, girl? I lost my daughter. I'm the only victim here." But Emily didn't back down. Her serene expression hid the storm of courage bubbling within her. The judge, uncomfortable, decided to allow the girl to speak, perhaps moved by the strange energy pervading the room. Raul watched in silence, almost in disbelief, that someone had found the strength to disarm the woman who, until then, had seemed invincible. Vilma raised her voice, trying to drown out the impact of the child's words. "That girl doesn't know what she's talking about. She can't even see." Nervous laughter rippled through some of the audience, but Emily didn't hesitate. "I don't see with my eyes, but I see with the truth. And I heard your voice that night, Vilma. I heard it when you entered Carolina's room before the police arrived." The revelation fell like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the air. Vilma tried to react, but her hand trembled as she held her daughter's photo. The judge, now interested, asked her to answer, but Vilma deflected, trying to change the subject. The audience began to suspect. There was something in that unbridled fury that seemed more like fear than pain. The duel between the two became a spectacle of courage versus desperation. Vilma, sweating, screamed, "You're making it up. You're being manipulated to save this murderer." But Emily, without missing a beat, replied, "I may be blind, but I'm not deaf, and everyone here needs to hear what you're trying to hide." The room filled with restless murmurs. Raul felt his heart race as if life was slowly being returned to him. Vilma, under pressure, glanced at the judge, begging for intervention, but not even Ramiro dared interrupt the flow of those words. Something greater than the formality of the courtroom was taking place there, a dispute over the truth before everyone's eyes. With each sentence, Emily exposed cracks in Vilma's wall of confidence. "You always said you found Carolina already dead, but how did you know it was cyanide before the forensic examination confirmed it?" The audience erupted in voices, questioning in unison. Vilma remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. Her gaze, once defiant, now wavered. I just assumed," she stammered, but no one believed her. Emily had planted doubt, and it was growing fast, suffocating the seemingly solid narrative of revenge. Vilma's mask began to shatter before everyone's eyes, revealing a fear previously hidden beneath tears and impassioned speeches. In the end, the entire courtroom was mesmerized by this unlikely clash. The blind girl, so small, had dismantled in minutes the aura of absolute certainty that had surrounded Vilma from the beginning. Raul, tears in his eyes, clenched his fists as if clawing back the chance to live. Vilma, cornered, tried to compose herself, but the damage was already done. The judge, still restrained, murmured, "The defense will have the floor." Emily took a deep breath, her chest heaving, as if her fragility were actually her greatest weapon. The duel wasn't over, but for the first time, the scales of justice were beginning to tip in favor of truth. The silence was so heavy that even the audience's breathing seemed to echo off the courtroom walls. Emily, standing firmly in the center of the room, raised her head and spoke with the same courage that had brought her there. "If you want true justice, then exhume Carolina's body. It's the only way to prove who's lying." Those words struck everyone like an unexpected blow. The request was bold, unthinkable, almost an affront to the grief Vilma wore like armor. Murmurs erupted, some mocking, others filled with surprise. "A blind girl asking for exhumation," they whispered. Judge Ramiro cleared his throat uncomfortably, unsure whether to reprimand her or heed the strange courage that brimmed in her voice. Raul, for his part, seemed reborn in that moment. For the first time, there was a real possibility of exposing the farce that condemned him. Vilma reacted with immediate fury, as if struck by a well-aimed arrow. "This is barbaric. To desecrate my daughter's grave because of a criminal," he shouted, his tears now closer to despair than pain. But Emily didn't back down, and her voice sounded even firmer. "What are you afraid of, Mrs. Vilma? If you speak the truth, the exhumation will only confirm your words." The audience erupted in comments, divided between mockery and curiosity. Many began to lean forward, drawn by the growing tension. It was like watching an unexpected spectacle, where the truth was being forcibly ripped from an innocent mouth. The judge, pressured by the audience demanding explanations, called for order, but doubt had already been cast. Emily continued, "I heard conversations that night, and I know the body holds answers that the eyes haven't seen, but the ears can't forget." The conviction in her words made even the most skeptical uncomfortable. Raul, overcome with emotion, let out a barely audible whisper, thank you, Emily." The audience, previously unanimous in its fury against him, now divided into two factions, those who mocked the girl's boldness and those who, intrigued, felt a spark of doubt about Vilma. The atmosphere became suffocating. Vilma persisted in her performance, but her tears no longer evoked the same compassion. "This child is being used," she repeated, but her voice sounded weak, like a wall beginning to crack. Emily, on the other hand, seemed unshakable. "Carolina's body holds the truth you fear. If there's nothing to hide, why so much fear?" The judge, faced with the mounting pressure, remained silent, absorbing the weight of the request. Urgency hung over the room, like an invisible clock ticking down to the revelation. The audience waited anxiously, as if on the verge of an inevitable climax. Raul, though still shackled by fear, began to believe that perhaps there was a chance to escape his cruel fate. Vilma, cornered, could no longer hide her unease. Her once proud posture now seemed fragile, as if about to crumble before the girl's proposal. The judge finally took a deep breath and declared, "The request will be considered." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Emily's proposal had changed everything. Justice, for the first time in that room, seemed to be approaching its true path. Emily's request opened a rift in the courtroom, and from that rift emerged the memory everyone was trying to bury. The scene returns to that fateful night. Vilma enters Carolina's room. The room is somber, lit only by the dim light of a lamp. Carolina is already slumped on the floor, her body inert next to the still half-empty glass. The silence is unsettling, but there's no sign of immediate despair in Vilma. On the contrary, her eyes scan the scene with a strange coldness, evaluating every detail like someone piecing together a puzzle. Her fingers touch the vial of poison left near the table, and a quick gesture reveals what no one would have guessed. She's repositioning it. Her expression, rather than pure grief, is laced with something enigmatic, almost calculated. Minutes later, the sound of sirens cuts through the silence. The police arrive in a hurry, guided by neighbors who heard the earlier screams of an argument. Vilma, now in tears, plays the role of the desperate mother. Her screams echo through the hallway. "It was Raul. He killed my daughter." Upon entering the room, the officers find the scene ready, almost staged. The jar of cyanide on the table, the bowl beside the body, and the tear-stained face of a mother who seemed to have all the answers at her fingertips. One of them tries to calm her, but she repeatedly insists on one name, Raul. Her premature conviction attracts attention, but the weight of her theatrical grief drowns out any initial suspicion. The detail few noticed, and which Emily dared to suggest, is in Vilma's gaze. Between the tears there were glimmers of control, as if she already knew exactly how to guide that narrative. When the police collect the cup, Vilma covers her face, but a small, ironic smile escapes for a split second. It was the expression of someone who had managed to weaponize a tragedy. The stage scene became evidence, and each object seemed placed to seal Raul's fate. The audience in the courtroom, hearing Emily's reconstruction, held their breath. Doubts grew, eroding the certainty that once seemed unshakable. In the courtroom, as the scene unfolds, mental images take over the audience. Some begin to exchange suspicious glances. "Could it be that she manipulated everything from the beginning?" they murmur. Raul, with teary eyes, feels that someone has finally seen what he couldn't prove. Emily describes firmly, "She didn't just find Carolina. She set the scene to incriminate Raul. Everything was ready before the forensics even arrived. Vilma squirms in her chair, sweat dripping down her forehead, her hands trembling. Her crying now sounds fake, even to the most naive. With each word the girl says, the mask of the avenging mother transforms into that of an uncovered villain. The revelation echoes like an earthquake in the courtroom. The audience, previously convinced of Raul's guilt, is now divided between indignation and shock. Some begin to look at Vilma with suspicion, noticing the inconsistency of her tears. Raul lifts his face, taking a deep breath, as if he can see the first ray of light after days of darkness. Emily firmly concludes, if you truly want justice, you must look at that night not as she told it, but as it happened. And I was there, hearing every detail. The judge, stunned, fixes Vilma with a cold stare. For the first time, the weight of doubt falls on her, not Raul. The courtroom was plunged into a palpable tension, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. Emily's revelation had transformed every glance in the room into a mirror of doubt. Vilma, who had previously reigned supreme as a vigilante mother, was now the target of suspicion. Her eyes roamed the audience, but instead of sympathy, they encountered hard, distrustful faces. Raul, still fragile, kept his eyes fixed on the blind girl, the only one who had dared to cross the wall of lies. Emily, steadfast as ever, awaited the answer that could change the course of history. Judge Ramiro, his expression grim, took a deep breath before announcing, in light of the above, this court authorizes the exhumation of Carolina's body. A deafening murmur erupted, shaking the walls of the courtroom. The audience reacted as if they had witnessed an earthquake. Some applauded in suppressed fury, others protested, and a few simply stared at each other in shock. Vilma screamed, her voice cracked with hysteria. No, this is an outrage. I will not allow them to violate my daughter's grave. But her protests sounded more like desperation than defense. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. Raul let out a heavy sigh, as if breathing again after days of suffocation. Emily remained motionless, but her posture radiated determination, as if she knew she had won the first battle. The mood in the room oscillated between chaos and anticipation. Journalists frantically took notes. Reporters whispered about the scandal that would explode in the news. Everyone there knew that this decision not only changed the course of the trial, but also opened a deep wound in Vilma's image. Raul, overcome with emotion, closed his eyes and felt tears stream down his face. For the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of despair, but of hope. The fate was still uncertain, but the darkness was beginning to give way to the flame of a truth that insisted on surfacing. Vilma, panicked, staggered back, holding onto the bench. Her eyes, red and tearful, now betrayed something beyond pain, fear. Fear that the farce would be unmasked, fear that the secrets hidden beneath the earth would finally scream louder than her tears. The audience, which had previously fed on her pain, now watched as she began to fall. Emily, oblivious to any of this, seemed to feel the weight of the moment. The truth cannot be buried, she said quietly, but loud enough to echo in the hearts of everyone present. The final scene unfolded with locked glances. Vilma, cornered, stared at Raul as if she could still overcome him with hatred. Raul, hopeful, kept his eyes fixed on Emily, his unlikely savior. The judge, rigid, closed the session with the promise that the exhumation would take place soon, and Emily, motionless, seemed to carry the responsibility of the entire truth on her shoulders. The courtroom dispersed into chaos, but one certainty lingered in the air. This story was far from over. The suspense lingered, leaving everyone hungry for the next revelation. Moral of the story: the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to emerge. Lies may manipulate for a time, but they never resist the courage of those who dare to face them. If you're hooked on this plot and want to find out what happens next, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe in Raul's innocence, or do you think there are still more secrets hidden in this story?